Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Eric Balkavage. We're back for another edition of Thyroid Answers Shorts. And today I want to respond to a thoughtful and respectful comment left on one of my recent videos, The Truth About T3, Why Your Thyroid Isn't Broken. And I want to say I appreciate when listeners take time to engage deeply and critically. And this particular comment brings up several important challenges to the ideas I present, especially around the adaptive thyroid physiology model and the cell danger response as contributors to hypothyroid physiology challenges. So in this episode, I'm going to start by reading the full comment and then break it down point by point. So the follower says, you make a lot of good points in your videos. For instance, you read the literature in detail and explain many aspects of thyroid physiology that others rarely ever touch upon. However, where I start to be a little less enthusiastic is when you insinuate that your cell danger response hypothyroidism theory applies to every single case. I've learned over the years to be suspicious when someone explains every single health problem by one single theory, which, although you believe to have observed it indirectly, has never been scientifically proven to apply to hypothyroidism to the extent you believe it to exist. Even you yourself admit in another video that 71% of your patients get better after 6 months. There's also the fact that NDT used to be the only treatment available for more than 70 years, and almost everyone used to do fairly well on it. Take, for instance, someone who acquired tissue resistance or thyroid receptor desensitization from years of Graves' disease due to extremely excessive free T4 and T3 levels in the blood, creating damage, and then suffers from hypothyroidism after surgery. I'm not convinced that in cases like these, your theory is the key, and there is any way to help such a person but to raise free T3 levels in the blood. And I'm going to interject here. When they say that the person struggles with hypothyroidism after thyroid surgery, if somebody's getting radioactive iodine treatment or a thyroidectomy following Graves' disease, there are going to be hypothyroids because they don't have a gland to make thyroid hormone anymore. And I think what they're really pointing to is persistent tissue hypothyroid signs and symptoms on T4 only. I think that's what they're referring to. And if the person who wrote this it thinks I'm saying that wrong, they can feel free to reach back out. The person goes on to say, are you familiar with the work of Dr. John Lowe, who is at the other extreme from you? He did help a lot of people with extreme tissue resistance to thyroid hormones and achieve durable positive results from using large doses of T3. Although, like you say, the body can deactivate it, that clearly doesn't seem to happen in every case. I believe that different strategies can help different people, but you do offer a valuable alternative and deserve to be heard. So I appreciate the comment, and I'm going to break these kind of comments down one by one and give some information. I think if this person who wrote this had these thoughts and feelings, there's probably other people, even some of my colleagues, that may feel the same way. So the first big point is, do I believe that the cell danger response in the adaptive thyroid model apply to every single case of hypothyroidism? And the answer is no, absolutely not. There may be other things that are maybe contributing to that drive hypothyroidism that maybe aren't represented by these two cell danger response in the adaptive thyroid model. There may be things that I'm not considering. So I'm not saying that every case of hypothyroidism is caused by the cell danger response. There are many mechanisms that can lead to hypothyroidism, hypothyroid signs and symptoms, glandular damage that can occur. There can be obviously, medications that can interfere. There's stress, trauma, but these are all things that are really part of that cell danger response. But could there be something outside the cell danger response that potentially triggers thyroiditis and hypothyroidism, or triggers reduced cellular transport of thyroid hormone, or chronic hypothyroid symptoms? I'm sure there are. And what I'm not saying is this is the only model. What I'm offering this as a new lens for understanding thyroid physiology, especially in people who have failed the conventional and even the functional care models. This is not a all or none paradigm. It's only cell danger response or bust. It's a framework that helps clinicians and patients explore why someone might still have symptoms despite having normal labs or being on what their clinician thinks is the right dose of medication. And frankly, if someone is doing great on their current therapy, that's awesome. Keep going. But if they're not and they feel stuck, this model offers potentially a new way forward. So I wish it was as simple that everything was just, this is the only way that things happen. But we don't know how the physiology actually works in every client. We don't know the actual triggering mechanisms. Everything essentially is hypothesis and theory. And then we look through a certain lens, a certain paradigm to treat our patients. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And there's oftentimes that we have a belief in a certain hypothesis or theory. We treat based on a hypothesis and theory. We see lots of people feel and function better. And then a decade or 2 or 3 later, we realize that what we thought was a mechanism of action for which we were providing treatment wasn't actually the case. And yet the patients still seem to get better in that model. So really important thing to consider. And keep in mind that when I started changing my belief process about what might be going on in a lot of these patients who are chronically struggling in both the allopathic and the functional space, where they weren't doing well on T4, they weren't doing well on NDT, they weren't doing well on high dose T3 medication, that's where I had to start rethinking this whole process. Like there must be something else going on here. And that's where I found the cell danger response. And that's where I started developing this adaptive thyroid physiology model versus the model that is generally understood in allopathic medicine and to a large degree in functional medicine, that the body's broken, that the immune system is just not recognizes self tissue and destroying it. And then it forgot how to convert T4 to T3 at an optimal level. The next comment that I want to talk about is the writer says that the comment that this whole hypothesis, the adaptive thyroid physiology model that's kind of built on this whole hypothesis of the cell danger response, has never been fully proven to be the root cause of hypothyroidism. And that's a fair point, but let's put it in context. There is no single proven cause of hypothyroidism in all patients. What we have are models, beliefs, hypotheses, all of which try to explain what we observe in practice. That's true for conventional medicine, functional medicine, and my own model, right? If we had a one cause mechanism and a one treatment strategy that worked for everybody, the discussion would be over. The problem is we really don't know. You'll see when you look at what triggers immune-driven thyroiditis, there's a combination of factors, like genetics are a factor, diet, lifestyle is a factor, toxins and organisms, all factors. And these are all the things we talk about as the things that might trigger a cell danger response as well. Okay. But what I'm proposing is a hypothesis. And yes, it is just that hypothesis. We haven't been able to prove it yet that this is actually the case. I think the general consensus is that it's some type of cell stress or inflammatory or defense response, and it seems to impact people with a certain set of genetic predisposition. But I don't know that we have the perfect scientific evidence to this point. We could say this is the only mechanism that occurs. And even though I propose this as a hypothesis, I just didn't kind of wake up one day and like, hey, I'll just throw this out there. The hypothesis is born from 30 years of clinical observation of patients who failed multiple paradigms. They failed in the traditional allopathic model. They failed in the functional and integrative model. And they failed with different types of hormone replacement therapy, T4, glandulars, T3 only, combinations of T4, T3, and glandulars. I mean, they failed trying every possible strategy, high dose, low dose, to optimize blood levels, assuming that optimal blood levels would fix all their signs and symptoms, and it just didn't work. The hypothesis is born on research into cellular stress response, inflammation, mitochondrial signaling, and a lot of time digging into the scientific literature. And oftentimes what I'm trying to do when I'm looking in the scientific literature is look for reasons why what I'm saying or this hypothesis I'm putting out there might not be valid as a general overall hypothesis for a lot of these people who are struggling and not doing well. And the third way that this hypothesis came about is because I really have a deep desire to help patients who feel like they've been left behind, like they've been told, hey, we've optimized you. We don't know what's left, right? We've optimized your T4, we've optimized your TSH, we've optimized your T3, we've optimized your reverse T3, we've optimized your TPO antibodies, your thyroglobulin antibodies. We've optimized what we can optimize. And if you still don't feel well, we don't know what else to do because your thyroid physiology is now optimal. Optimal based on what, though, is the question. Is it optimal in the blood based on what? If the patient's chronically ill and has chronic hypothyroid signs and symptoms, just because you manipulate their blood levels of a hormone doesn't mean you've optimized them. It means you manipulated their chemistry. But it assumes that what we saw as a low or high blood value was the problem versus what we saw as a low or high blood value was the body's response, the body's adaptive response to some type of stress trigger. And I think we want to add too that if all of the models had worked consistently, I wouldn't have had to build a new one, but they don't. I wish they did. And just like any scientific hypothesis, time and research will ultimately validate, refine, or disprove this model. But until then, the outcomes we see, symptom resolution, improved conversion, reduced medication needs, support its clinical value. The next point I want to cover is where the person says that I guess the reason that the cell danger response in this adaptive thyroid physiology model probably aren't valid in everybody is because only 71% of my patients improve in 6 months. And what I've said over and over again is that when I look over the last 4 years, because we had to go back and do this kind of tally for a third party to say, okay, what's the success of your treatment look like? We went back, took 3 years. Now it's been 4 years, and looked at the changes in patients' signs and symptoms and medication changes over that time frame. And I said that in a 6-month period of time, my clients see a 71% improvement of their signs and symptoms and measurables on average. It doesn't mean everybody has 71%. That means some people get 100%, some people 90%, some people only down maybe 20 or 30% improvement in a 6-month time frame. But that's the average over 4 months. It doesn't mean that only 71% of my patients improve in 6 months. It's saying that when we take a look at all of the clients that I've seen over the last 4 years, since we've been actually going back and starting to track it, the average person who comes into my practice, we typically see about a 71% improvement of their signs, their symptoms, and labs. Oftentimes, as we're reducing the amount of medication they're needing to take, okay, that's pretty good. So if the person listening to this said, man, if I could get a 71% improvement of my symptoms in the first 6 months of working with them, I would take that, because what has the improvement been in their last 6 months? So I wanted to clarify that. That's number one. Number two, most of the people who come to see me are not people who've freshly been diagnosed with hypothyroidism and haven't had any thyroid medication before. I do get those patients that come to see me because they're looking for a potentially more natural approach to addressing what's going on with their thyroid physiology, or they've heard me speak and they resonate with this adaptive thyroid physiology model. But most of the patients who come to see me are people who've already failed on T4 only. They've already failed at NDT, or they've already failed on T3 protocols. And that, what I mean by failed is, it's not that any of these medications didn't change their signs and symptoms, but it didn't restore their health. It didn't get them to where they wanted to go. They're coming to see me after seeing multiple other practitioners because they're caught or stuck in what I call thyroid purgatory, the state between where they were before medication and where they think they should be if they were truly optimized, or their thyroid physiology has truly been optimized. So it is, the model in itself is not a failure, or it's not that it doesn't work because there's only a 71% improvement in somebody's signs and symptoms in 6 months. I think we'd have to say the opposite. If this model, where we're reducing excessive stressors on somebody's physiology, many times with minimal amount of supplementation, is improving when people come in, the average person seeing a 71% improvement in 6 months by reducing stressors, using this adaptive thyroid model and the cell danger response model as the paradigm or the lens through which we look at what's going on with them, and then reducing this excessive cell stress response. And we're seeing a 71% improvement in just 6 months. I don't think that means that the model is a problem. I think that it actually starts to help validate how important this model might be for those people who continue to struggle, regardless of the type of thyroid hormone replacement therapy they use. So the next point I want to cover is, the person says, and I think they're using this as a justification for NDT, because they were essentially talking about how for greater than 70 years, NDT was the primary treatment strategy before Synthroid came along. And people did fairly well. So that goes against what I'm saying, is that there's a reduced, in these people who struggle with signs and symptoms, that reduced and have reduced T4 to T3 conversion, he's saying essentially that T3 is the answer, and that NDT is the strategy that's been given the longest. But I don't know what they're really trying to get from that, because just because something has been used for a long time doesn't mean that it's the appropriate strategy. We do a lot of things and treat with a lot of things, and that doesn't mean that strategy is the one and only answer. I mean, we've been using aspirin to treat conditions for over 100 years. And we're still learning that while there's risks, or while there's benefits, there's also some risks and limitations in using aspirin. So, does it mean that aspirin is bad? No. Does it mean that it's the only treatment strategy, or that it has no negative consequences? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And I guess the other part of that is when he's saying that it's been used for, greater than 70 years and patients did fairly well, what does fairly well mean? Is fairly well mean that they've restored their optimal health? Does that mean that they've have no more chronic hypothyroid signs and symptoms? Is fairly well the goal? That may not be what they meant, but he may say, hey, people took NDT thyroid for a lot of time and and that was the only treatment, and they seem to do better. Sure, any thyroid hormone is potentially going to be better than having none. But that doesn't mean that we should stop there. Just because we can change some lab values and we get some temporary symptoms doesn't mean we should continue to try and consider why the patient may still have continual signs and symptoms, even though they've been on T4 or T3 or a combination like an NDT. And I think that we covered that one. The next point that the person talks about is, I guess they're talking about where they were talking about Graves' disease. And they said that in cases, what about, shouldn't people who've had Graves' disease and have potentially had receptor desensitization, they probably need T3 because of what's happened. So that it's interesting. There are some people, I guess, who've had Graves' disease for an extended period of time. They've had high T4 and T3 for years, then get surgery and now struggle with symptoms. I see that all the time. And what the commenter is arguing is that these people have receptor desensitization or receptor resistance due to having this chronic hyperthyroid state for an extremely long period of time. And that maybe in these people, T3 may be the only option to raise their T3 levels. I don't know. I don't know if that we have literature and research that shows that somebody who has hyperthyroidism Graves and then has their thyroid gland removed is going to have persistent reduction in thyroid hormone transport, which I think he's primarily referring to. So this is a person who won't be able to get T4 to T3 into the cells after that. And that they're saying, I guess, that T3 is the only option. Well, I don't know if we have literature that tells us that we'll have long-term thyroid receptor resistance after the thyroid gland has been removed or they've had radioactive iodine. I haven't seen that literature yet. And if it's out there, how long does it last for? What does the science show? How long does this thyroid resistance or receptor desensitization last for? Does it last for 6 months? Does it last for a year? Does it last for 2 years, 10 years, into perpetuity? I don't know. I mean, if that literature is there, please share it. I haven't seen it. But I think there's a couple key points that potentially might be missed here. And the thing we need to consider, or we might ask for somebody who's had Graves' disease or hyperthyroidism, had their thyroid gland removed, and they've gone on thyroid medication, especially T4, and they haven't felt well, or they had persistently low total T3 or free T3, what we might have to ask is, maybe there's still receptor desensitization or receptor resistance, but maybe the other thing we have to ask is, what caused the Graves' disease to begin with, right? Is the thing that triggered this immune-driven hyperthyroidism, this Graves' disease, what triggered the immune system to do it? Is there a stress trigger that's still there that at one point activated the immune system, and because of that person's unique genetics and situation, it triggered hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease? But now that the gland is gone, if that trigger is still there, could that same trigger not only cause hyperthyroidism in that patient, but which wouldn't be possible anymore because they don't have a gland, but it could still continue to trigger and activate the immune response. And now that that hyperthyroid activity is gone, now we're seeing a person who's, because of this, the stressor, the trigger is potentially still there, or the immune system is still dysregulated. Now they're having the opposite effect where they can't convert T4 to T3 as optimally because of the cell stress inflammatory response. We have to ask that question. Just because we take out a gland or irradiate a gland doesn't mean we've addressed the cause. It doesn't mean that the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3 is optimal. Even in a hyperthyroid state, I guess somebody could say, well, obviously they converted T4 to T3 well before because they were hyperthyroid and they had lots of T3, but there's other mechanisms at play in that situation. Allostatic regulatory mechanisms that are at play to try and help manage that condition. It doesn't mean the person's going to have optimal intracellular conversion of T4 to T3. There's going to be other mechanisms, especially deiodinase 1 being highly upregulated in that situation to do the conversion of T4 to T3. And it's my belief that the reason there's an upregulation of deiodinase 1 in these hyperthyroid states is because the half-life of T4 is, somewhere around a week, and too much T4 in circulation, too much free T4 being available could also create a problem. So the half-life of T3 is like 24 hours. So if we can convert T4 to T3 and there's some cellular resistance going on, that T3 is going to be metabolized much faster. Let me see what else we got here. Let's talk about the last point I think this person made was that maybe I shouldn't discount T3. And let's keep in mind that I'm not discounting T3. He's talking about how this Dr. John Lowe is at the other extreme from me. Like, I believe that there's an adaptive response going on where the person has not a reduced ability to convert T4 to T3, but that the body is adaptively decreasing transport into the cell, adaptively decreasing conversion of T4 to T3, not that it is, not that the physiology is broken. And what he's going on to say is that this Dr. John Lowe has done a lot of work saying that in these cases where somebody's on T4 and they still have low T4 to T3 conversion, their T3 is low, their free T3 is low. When this guy would treat these patients, he would do high dose T3 and get some positive results. Well, of course you would. And there's lots of people doing T3 monotherapy or doing high dose T3 in conjunction with T4 or in conjunction with their glandular hormone. And people get positive signs and symptoms by taking T3. There's no argument about that. The issue is, does overloading the system with T3 medication, does it change symptoms? No, it can absolutely. It can change symptoms. Does it restore thyroid homeostatic regulation? In many cases, or in some cases, maybe the person is truly broken and they can't make thyroid hormone. They can't convert it. The receptors are broken. The transport mechanism is broken. Maybe, I guess somebody could make that argument. I don't necessarily believe that to be the case, because I get patients that have been on high dose T3 medication and still struggling with hypothyroid symptoms and hyperthyroid symptoms in many cases, and coming off trying to reduce that dose as they try and reduce the dose. And especially if they've been on higher dose T3 for an extended period of time, it is difficult and very uncomfortable for them to try and reduce the dose. They're almost like an addict trying to get off, whatever drug it is that they're addicted to, because it can be that uncomfortable and that difficult to go from high dose T3, where you're forcing the physiology and suppressing the amount of T4 that's in the system, and becoming highly dependent on T3 only, and then try to titer it down when you don't have a thyroid gland that's been working in a while, or don't have a thyroid gland at all, or you don't have a sufficient thyroid T4 via your thyroid hormone replacement therapy that's available as the T3 goes down. Because as the T3 goes down, you need to be able to have some circulating T4 to be able to convert to T3. And if you just start titering down T3 and you don't have T4 in the bloodstream because of either your gland's gone or the gland's been atrophied by taking this high dose T3 for a period of time, you're not going to feel good right away. It has to become like a really slow titer. And those people are often going to need T4 as they go up. But let's talk about the reasons why T3 might help somebody who's got low total, low free T3 and poor conversion. Well, T3 is less tightly bound by the thyroid binding globulin. So keep in mind that most of the thyroid hormones transported throughout the body bound to a transport protein. Because of changes in pH and temperature, typically there may be some other factors there that the T3 becomes free of the binding globulin. So it gets essentially the binding globulin is the Uber and the hormone is essentially the passenger. So when bound hormone gets to a tissue that needs it and it becomes free, then it's able to get into the cell. And T3 is less tightly bound. So it's easier to get T3 off of that binding globule than it is T4. So if there's immune inflammatory processes going on, T3 might be easier to get into somebody's cells. So they could feel potentially better. Once T3 gets into the cells and the transport mechanisms, it does seem that the transport mechanisms, it's easier to get T3 into the cell than T4. And then once T3 is inside the cell, it's already in its ready state. It doesn't have to go through another step to be converted, and it can bind to receptors at much higher affinity than T4 is going to be, and you don't have this extra step. So it can be helpful, but it doesn't fix everybody, because there's a lot of people that take T3 and despite optimizing their total T3 or their free T3 with medication, still struggle with signs and symptoms of tissue hypothyroidism. And more doesn't necessarily restore thyroid physiology. Why? Because the cells get to determine what the T3 state is inside the cell, many of them. Some need T3 from the bloodstream only, and other tissues take in T3 from the bloodstream, but also can manage or adapt the amount of T3 in the cell via the deiodinases by bringing T4 and determining how much of that T4 it needs to convert. So it's not as simple as, hey, just give more thyroid hormone as T3 and this will fix everything. Can it change signs and symptoms? Absolutely. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that it is going to be dependent on the state of the individual. If somebody's not in a overly stressed state and they're in homeostasis, T4 should work. And T3 may make them feel a little bit better. But it should restore their physiology if they're in a homeostatic regulation, because in a homeostatic state, the only issue may be that there's not enough available T4. And especially if they're fully replacing what a gland would have made with the amount of T4 they're taking, then they should provide some additional T3, because if you're fully replacing what the thyroid gland would have made from a T4 perspective, essentially what you're doing is you're shutting down the gland, then you should probably give the appropriate level of 5 to 10 micrograms of T3 as well. The other thing I think that's important is, and I think it's important for everybody, when we talk about there's reduced T4 to T3 conversion, or there's a reduced transport, or there's a process going on. It's not like the cell stops converting T4 to T3. Like, okay, there's thyroid resistance going on. So no T4 or T3 is getting into a cell where there's inflammatory mechanisms or high cortisol or anything else that may interfere with this thyroid receptor. It's not on or off like that. It's not black and white. It's shades of gray. There's less transport, but no transport. Okay. When we talk about reduced conversion of T4 to T3, it's not that there's no conversion of T4 to T3. There's a reduced conversion when we think about the net effect. When we say there's an increased conversion of T4 to reverse T3 or T3 to T2. It's not all or none. It's a net. So when we think about what's happening net in the cell, there's a net decreased level of T3. There's a net increased conversion of T4 to reverse T3, or a net increased deactivation of T3 to T2. And by the way, we don't measure T2 in traditional labs. So just keep that in mind. So I think it's really important to say, if you feel great on whatever thyroid medication you're taking, T4, NP thyroid, Armor, T3 only, great. I don't care. If you feel great, I'm happy for you. And I think whatever you're doing is the right thing to do. But when it's not working, when you can't find the magic dose of T4, so now you try adding some T3 and it feels good for a bit and then it doesn't last. And then you try NDT, NP thyroid or Armor, and it feels better, but then it doesn't last. And now maybe you're adding T4 on top of the Armor, or you're adding T3 on top of the NP thyroid, and you're constantly searching for the right dose and you still don't feel and function well. These are the people I'm trying to speak out to. These are the people that you need to start to understand there may be another way to help you get better by looking at what's going on at the cell level through this different model, this different hypothesis, different lens, through the adaptive thyroid model and the cell danger response. If this didn't work, I wouldn't be talking about it. And if it didn't work, we wouldn't have so many people resonating with this model and saying, hey, I've tried everything else. Let me try this idea, this concept, this model, and seeing the positive changes, the positive results, the improvement of signs and symptoms and measurables, and the ability to reduce the amount of thyroid medication they take with improved conversion, and for some people, not even needing the thyroid medication in time at all. So to the commenter, I want to thank you for raising these points. You've helped push this conversation forward, and I respect that. My goal for everybody isn't to be right. It's to help people think differently and give clinicians a new lens when the old one stops or isn't working. If you're doing well, keep going. But if you're stuck, maybe it's time to look at your thyroid through a different lens. Until next time, keep asking better questions and take care of your thyroid and overall physiology.